Hey guys, before we get into the content of this video, I'd just like to give a quick shout out. The channel just reached 2,000 subscribers, which is awesome. I didn't expect to reach that kind of milestone this quickly, so genuinely thank you to each and every one of you who subscribed recently. And I just wanted to ask you guys, how would you like to celebrate? We could do some kind of, I don't know, Q&A video, maybe a live stream. I don't know. What would you guys like to see? Let me know down in the comments section below and enjoy the rest of the video. I think adaptations are a funny thing. You can either end up with gold that feels just like the thing it's based on, or something so far removed you can't even tell it's an adaptation of another work to begin with. And that's what I'd like to start exploring in my new series, Page to Screen. So for those of you who don't know how this is gonna work, because this is the first episode, essentially, we'll be exploring the broad strokes of what remain the same between the comics and the adaptation in question, followed by the more substantial changes made during the adaptation process, and finally, everything left on the dreaded cutting room floor. But with that, let's not waste any more time, let's get to it. So, what epic did I choose from for the inaugural episode of what will hopefully be an ongoing series? For this, I turned to what many consider the definitive take on many of the comic book industry's most iconic characters, the DC animated universe, specifically Justice League Unlimited. Season 1, Episode 2, For the Man Who Has Everything, based on the comic story of the same name featured in Superman Annual Number 11. Published in 1985, this is a pretty special little story, written by renowned British wizard Alan Moore, and drawn by artist Dave Gibbons. If those names sound familiar to you at all, they also did some other work for DC and the comic industry as a whole, including this one graphic novel you probably haven't heard of, it wasn't all that popular. Something about a watch man? I don't know, seems pretty dumb to me. Don't see why anyone would read that when we've got a story about Superman's friends trying to free him from an evil plant on his birthday. Jokes aside, this is the only adaptation of Moore's work that he approves of by the time of this recording, and the only one he's allowed to have his name attached to, which is some mighty high praise given his attitude towards any adaptation of his work nowadays. So, what was the special sauce that did the impossible and gained his approval? Let's find out as we dive into the connective tissue. This is likely going to be the longest session as it's incredibly faithful, so let's try and make it as brief as possible. Both the comic and episode begin with Batman and Wonder Woman arriving at the Fortress of Solitude, gifts in hand with the intention of celebrating Superman's birthday. This takes a turn as they find him in the thrall of a parasite by the name of the Black Mercy, a plant that feeds on the host while subjecting them to their greatest fantasy, making them not want to get rid of it. This plant was a trap by Mongol, recurring Superman baddie and ruler of Warworld, basically an artificial planet made specifically for gladiator fights for his amusement. They both appeal to his ego by getting him to monologue about what the plant does to its victims, Wonder Woman getting fed up with it and trying to throw hands only for it to hurt her more than it hurts him. Mongol makes it abundantly clear that really their only hope is to break Superman out of his parasite-induced dream world. Said dream world is a fantasy that Jor-El was wrong all those years ago and Krypton never exploded. So Kal-El gets to have a family on the planet and culture he never got to experience for himself. This comes crashing down as he has to accept this ideal life isn't real and he snaps back to reality, and the plant releases him only to end up on Hawkgirl instead. And he sees exactly what you'd expect in a vision of his perfect life, which doesn't last long as he gets the plant off pretty quickly. Superman, however, is furious, since from his perspective, he just had an entire happy lifetime ripped away from him, and he beats Mongol pretty savagely. Eventually, they manage to get the upper hand by regifting the Black Mercy to him, trapping Mongol in a dream world full of death and torment, and this all wraps up with the trio lamenting the destruction caused, such as the intended gift of a special one-of-a-kind flower named the Krypton, which was crushed during the fight. So, yeah, this was by far the longest segment in the entire video. They really stuck to the original story as closely as possible, even being word for word in some scenes.
Pupils aren't contracting even slightly. He must be cut off from all sensation.
I fashioned a prison that you couldn't leave without sacrificing your heart's desire. It must have been like tearing off your own arm. Happy birthday, Kryptonian. I give you oblivion. Burn!
Really, the only changes made were due to this episode being part of a shared universe with its own continuity. Normally, this is where I talk about the changes made, but for this specific instance, we need to go over what was ignored entirely so we can understand the changes that resulted from it. Now, you probably guessed from the awkward cropping and massive censor bar that there's actually a fourth hero present during all this. That hero being none other than Robin, specifically Jason Todd. Now, the reason for this is twofold. One, in the DC animated universe, Jason Todd doesn't actually exist. Rather, Tim Drake was the second and final Robin due to the crew generally preferring to use who was active in the comics at the time, along with general unease regarding Jason's grim fate being way too much for a kid's cartoon. So as a result, DCAU Tim is basically a hybrid between comic Tim and Jason. Now, they could have just used Tim here instead, but presumably weren't permitted due to the same reason most Batman characters didn't appear in Justice League or Justice League Unlimited. That reason would be the Bat embargo. For those of you who don't know, this could make for its own video in its own right, but to keep it brief, Bat characters other than Batman himself couldn't really appear in more than one thing at a time. WB thought it would confuse general audiences. So, for example, Ra's al Ghul and Scarecrow couldn't show up in JLU or the Batman because the Nolan movies called dibs. And more important to this video, Robin couldn't appear since another Robin was already a main character over on Teen Titans at the time. Normally the Bat embargo gets a lot of flack, and rightfully so, but this instance I can actually understand since there's still confusion to this very day on whether or not Teen Titans is canon to the DCAU. It's not, but the point still stands. But back to the episode. As a result, most of Jason's contributions, such as prying the plant off of Batman, were given to Wonder Woman instead. And the story barely changes, to be honest. If nothing else, it just gave Diana more agency since she was kind of a punching bag in the comic. Oh, and in the comic, Mongol also needed special gloves to handle the Black Mercy. In the episode, anyone can just handle it pretty normally, save for having the risk of it latching onto them, but ultimately this is a pretty extraneous detail that makes zero difference to the story as a whole, so I can see why it would have been left out. That's really about it as far as this adaptation outright ignored, so let's get into some changes! As far as changes go, this is where it gets interesting. Pretty much all the dialogue is the same intent, but has been more or less rewritten with modern verbiage, so I won't really get into what quotes were changed since we'd be here all day. I just like to highlight this instance of Wonder Woman cutting herself off because you can't do a swear on kids' television.
Go to.
Other than that, Darkwing and War Woman's fight with Mongol is pretty much untouched. It's Superman's side of things that gets really interesting. So, his perfect little family has been shuffled around a tiny bit. Instead of Lila the actress in the comic, Cal's now married to Loanna. Her occupation isn't mentioned, but she's a hybrid of his two known love interests in the DCAU, Lois Lane and Lana Lang, presumably referencing how he typically has feelings for both women. And instead of being a father of two, here he only has a son. Still named Van in both versions, though. Pretty minor stuff so far, but here's where it veers wildly into two very different directions. In both versions, Superman's fantasy involves a world where Krypton had never exploded. That makes perfect sense, right? In the episode, it's by all accounts a utopia, a perfect world. Cal and Van see Grandpa Jor-El at work and they have a nice time, save for the occasional tremor only Cal seems to notice, implied to be his subconscious trying to break the illusion. Cal also grows more overtly suspicious of everything as the illusion slowly falls apart. Aside from the tremors, Jor-El's voice even changes from the actor he had in Superman the Animated Series to Mike Farrell, who voices Pa Kent in the DCAU.
Go on up with your father, Van.
I'll be along in a few minutes.
This is such a subtle detail you could never pull off in a visual-only medium such as comics, and I genuinely never even noticed this until rewatching the episode for this very video. So, up until he figures out it's an illusion, it sounds like an all-around perfect life, right? Well, hold on to your pants, dear viewer, because holy
Frag.
the comic version is about as polar opposite as you can possibly get. So, we already start off on a pretty sour note right off the bat. Cal's birthday party had just ended, and he's lamenting that his father, Jor-El, didn't show up. Evidently, in this telling of the story, he didn't take the whole being wrong about Krypton being doomed thing nearly as well, and he became quite the bitter son of a
Glitch.
So he does the completely reasonable thing, and instead of owning up to his colossal mistake, he becomes a member of the Kryptonian equivalent of the Klan. No, this is not me exaggerating for comedic effect. Jor-El allies himself with the old Krypton movement, an extremist political group violently campaign against the likes of immigration and cruel and unusual punishment such as being sent to the Phantom Zone being banned. The latter is a particular point of contention since a lot of the protests get rather violent to the point of people such as Kara, Supergirl in the normal universe, being hospitalized for no other reason than being in the House of El. Guilt by association as Jor-El is the one who invented the Phantom Zone projector. The aforementioned campaigning includes but is not limited to members of the old Krypton movement burning swords, which I can only assume are their equivalent of crosses during their rallies. Even their outfits look pretty reminiscent of the Klan. The sheer whiplash between the episode and the comic continues to get me even after rereading it several times for this video. Batman's fantasy is a little more involved. What we do see is about the same, but he also briefly mentions living an entire lifetime where he marries Kathy Kane, the Silver Age Batwoman, and they have a teenage daughter together. One particular change I find interesting and really enjoy that plays to the strengths of each medium is Mongul's fantasy when he's enthralled by the Black Mercy at the end. In the comic, he slaughters the Trinity and continues his torment throughout the galaxy, as countless aliens worship at his feet and Warworld roams throughout the galaxy, decimating entire planets in its wake. In the episode, however, we never actually see what he sees. Instead, we just get a slow zoom into his barely cognizant face as we just hear fighting and screams of agony. Legitimately really chilling stuff. Dear God, this became a downer. Let's end off on something fun, shall we? So, the gifts Nighthawk and Power Princess get for Hyperion are slightly different here. In the show, Batman gets cash because, as he says so himself,
I mean, what do you buy for the man who has everything?
He said it! He said it!
and it's Wonder Woman who gets the one-of-a-kind flower. In the comic, it's actually Batman who gives him the rose, and Wonder Woman gives him a replica of the bottled city of Kandor. This leads to a much-needed visual gag where Superman has to fly back and hide the actual bottled city of Kandor in a closet, since, well, why does he need a replica when he already has the real thing? The reason for this change is pretty obvious. It wouldn't really make sense since Kandor wasn't bottled in the DCAU. That's not really Brainiac's MO in this universe. As for why the other changes were made, as far as I can tell, it's really just a case of streamlining the story to fit its runtime. The comic was an annual, so it had a whopping 40 pages to tell its story rather than the usual 22 or 23 pages of a normal issue. So the crew of JLU had to trim the fat as much as possible to fit the story into a single 22-minute episode. And honestly, I find all the changes here were for the best, really. In the episode, we get to see Superman growing more suspicious of the world he finds himself in. He notices his father suddenly get his voice recast mid-sentence for no discernible reason, and the tremors only he notices are more than enough of a red flag. But in the comic, he just bounces from mortifying event to mortifying event until he realizes none of it's real. I've seen theories that the situation steadily growing worse and worse is indicative of his mind subconsciously rejecting the illusion. But there's nothing really in the comic to indicate that, so I have to take that as headcanon rather than fact. So that was For the Man Who Has Everything. No matter the medium, this firmly goes down as one of the greatest Superman tales ever told. It really hits what I think is great about Superman as a character. Despite having what many consider godlike power, Mongul is completely wrong, and his greatest fantasy isn't being a god or any kind of ruler. His greatest fantasy is just being happily married with a loving wife and child. Or children in the comics case. But if I were to revisit it again after this, I'd personally go with the JLU episode. I find the changes made just make the entire story feel much tighter and more cohesive, but it's still a fantastic story either way, and I highly recommend experiencing it in both mediums. And I think Alan Moore feels the same way, given this is, to date, the only adaptation of his work he doesn't vehemently loathe. You know you did something right if he actually authorizes his name to be credited. Come to think of it, it may be worth looking at the other adaptations of his work to see why he's grown such a deep hatred of them. But that's enough rambling from me today. Now I want to hear rambling from you guys. Let me know what you think of this kind of format. Would you like to see me analyze other comic book adaptations such as this? If so, let me know down in that funny little comment section down below. As always, thank you for watching. This has been Major Disaster signing off, and make sure to look away from your screen for at least 20 units to reduce eye strain.